By listening to this short ad, you are supporting our podcast. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it is the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's free. There is creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Thank you. On the one hand, certain transformations got to work on it, falsifying the text in accord with secret tendencies, maiming and extending it until it was turned into its opposite. On the other hand, an indulgent piety reigned over it, anxious to keep everything as it stood, indifferent to whether the details fitted together or nullified one another. Thus, almost everywhere, there can be found striking omissions, disturbing repetitions, palpable contradictions, signs of things the communication of which was never intended. The distortion of a text is not unlike a murder. The difficulty lies not in the execution of the deed, but in the doing away with the traces. One could wish to give the word distortion the double meaning to which it has a right, although it is no longer used in this sense. It should mean not only quotation to change the appearance of, end of quotation, but also quotation to wrench apart, end of quotation, quotation to put in another place, end of quotation. That is why in so many textual distortions we may count on finding the suppressed and abnegated material hidden away somewhere, though in an altered shape and torn out of its original connection. Only it is not always easy to recognize it. The distorting tendencies we want to detect must have influenced the traditions before they were written down. One of them, perhaps the strongest of all, we have already discovered. We said that when the new god Yahweh in Kadesh was instituted, something had to be done to glorify him. It is truer to say he had to be established, made room for. Traces of former religions had to be extinguished. This seems to have been done successfully with the religion of the settled tribes. No more was heard of it. With the returning tribe, the task was not so easy. They were determined not to be deprived of the exodus from Egypt, the man Moses, and the custom of circumcision. It is true they had been in Egypt, but they had left it again, and from now on every trace of Egyptian influence was to be denied. Moses was disposed of by displacing him to Midian and Kadesh and making him into one person with the priest who founded the Java religion. Circumcision, the most compromising sign of the dependence on Egypt, had to be retained, but in spite of all existing evidence, every endeavor was made to divorce this custom from Egypt. The enigmatic passage in Exodus, written in an almost incomprehensible style, saying that God had been wroth with Moses for neglecting circumcision, and that his Midianite wife saved his life by a speedy operation, can be interpreted only as a deliberate contradiction of the significant truth. We shall soon come across another invention for the purpose of invalidating a piece of inconvenient evidence. It is hardly to be described as a new tendency. It is only the continuation of the same one when we find an endeavor completely to deny that Yahweh was a new God, one alien to the Jews. For that purpose, the myth of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, are drawn upon. Yahweh maintains that he had been the God of those patriarchs. It is true, and he has to admit this himself. They did not worship him under this name. He does not add under what other name he used to be worshipped. Here the opportunity was taken to deal a decisive blow at the Egyptian origin of the custom of circumcision. Yahweh was said to have already demanded it from Abraham, to have instituted it as a sign of the bond between him and Abraham's descendants. This, however, was a particularly clumsy invention. If one wished to use a sign to distinguish someone from other people, one would choose something that the others did not possess, certainly not something that millions could show. An Israelite finding himself in Egypt would have had to recognize all Egyptians as brothers, bound by the same bond, brothers in Yahweh. The fact that circumcision was native to the Egyptians could not possibly have been unknown to the Israelites who created the text of the Bible. The passage from Joshua, quoted by E. Meyer, freely admits this, but nevertheless the fact had at all costs to be denied. We cannot expect religious myths to pay scrupulous attention to logical connections. Otherwise, the feeling of the people might have taken exception, justifiably so, to the behavior of a deity who makes a covenant with his patriarchs containing mutual obligations, and then ignores his human partners for centuries until it suddenly occurs to him to reveal himself again to their descendants. Still more astonishing is the conception of a God suddenly choosing a people, making it his people and himself its own God. I believe it is the only case in the history of human religions. In other cases, the people and their God belong inseparably together. They are one from the beginning. Sometimes it is true, we hear of a people adopting another God, but never of a God choosing a new people. Perhaps we approach an understanding of this unique happening when we reflect on the connection between Moses and the Jewish people. Moses had stooped the Jews, had made them his people. They were his chosen people, in quotation marks. There was yet another purpose in bringing the patriarchs into the new Javeh religion. They had lived in Canaan. Their memory was connected with certain localities in the country. Possibly they themselves had been Canaanites, heroes or local divinities, whom the immigrating Israelites had adopted for their early history. By evoking them, one gave proof, so to speak, of having been born and bred in the country, and denied the odium that clings to the alien conqueror. It was a clever turn. The god Javeh gave them only what their ancestors had once possessed. In the latter contributions to the biblical text, the tendency to avoid mentioning Kadesh met with success. The site of the founding of the new religion definitely became the divine mountains Sinai Horeb. The motive is not clearly visible. Perhaps they did not want to be reminded of the influence of Midian, but all later distortions, especially those of the priestly code, serve another aim. There was no longer any need to alter in a particular direction descriptions of happenings of long ago. That had long been done. On the other hand, an endeavor was made to date back to an early time certain laws and institutions of the present, to base them as a rule on the Mosaic law, and to derive from this their claim to holiness and blinding force. However, much the picture of past times in this way became falsified. The procedure does not lack a certain psychological justification. It reflected the fact that in the course of many centuries, about 800 years had elapsed between the Exodus and the fixation of the biblical text by Ezra and Nehemiah. The religion of Javeh had followed a retrograde development that had culminated in a fusion, perhaps the point of actual identity, with the original religion of Moses. And this is the essential outcome, the faithful content of the religious history of the Jews. Seven, among all the events of Jewish prehistory, that poets, priests, and historians of a later age undertook to portray, there was an outstanding one, the suppression of which was called for by the most obvious and best human motives. It was the murder of the great leader and liberator, Moses, which Selon divined from clues furnished by the prophets. Selon's presumption cannot be called fanciful. It is probable enough. Moses, trained in Ecnaton school, employed the same methods as the king. He gave commands and forced his religion on the people. Perhaps Moses' doctrine was still more uncompromising than that of his master. He had no need to retain any connection with the religion of the sun god, since the school of On would have no importance for his alien people. Moses met with the same fate as Echnaton, that fate which awaits all enlightened despots. The Jewish people of Moses was quite as unable to bear such a highly spiritualized religion, to find in what is offered satisfaction for their needs, as were the Egyptians of the 18th dynasty. In both cases, the same thing happened. Those who felt themselves kept in tutelage or who felt dispossessed revolted and threw off the burden of a religion that had been forced on them. But while the tamed Egyptians waited until fate had removed the sacred person of their pharaoh, the savage Semites took their destiny into their own hands and did away with their tyrant. Nor can we maintain that the biblical text preserved to us does not prepare us for such an end to Moses. The account of the wandering in the wilderness, which might stand for the time of Moses' rule, describes a series of grave revolts against his authority, which by Yahweh's command were suppressed with savage chastisement. It is easy to imagine that one of those revolts came to another end than the text admits. The people's falling away from the new religion is also mentioned in the text, though as a mere episode. It is the story of the golden calf, where by an adroit turn the breaking of the tables of the law, which has to be understood symbolically. In brackets, he has broken the law, is ascribed to Moses himself and imputed to his angry indignation. There came a time when the people regretted the murder of Moses and tried to forget it. This was certainly so at the time of the coming together at Kadesh. If, however, the Exodus were brought nearer in time to the founding of their religion in the oasis and one allowed Moses instead of other founder to help in it, then not only were the claims of the Moses people satisfied, but the painful fact of his violent removal was also successfully denied. In reality, it is most unlikely that Moses could have participated in the events at Kadesh, even if his life had not been shortened. Here we must try to elucidate the sequence of these events. We have placed the Exodus from Egypt in the time after the extinction of the 18th dynasty, 1350 BC. It might have happened then or a little later, for the Egyptian chroniclers included the subsequent years of anarchy in the reign of Harim-Hab, the king who brought it to an end and who reigned until 1315. The next aid in fixing the chronology, and it is the only one, is given by the stele of Merenheptah, 1225 to 1215, which extols the victory over Israel, and the destruction of their seeds, thick in brackets. Unfortunately, the value of this tale is doubtful. It is taken to be evidence that Israelite tribes were at that date already settled in Canaan. E. Meyer rightly concludes from this tale that Merenheptah could not have been the pharaoh of the Exodus, as one had previously been wont to assume. The Exodus must belong to an earlier period. The question who was pharaoh at the time of the Exodus appears to me an idle one. There was no pharaoh at the time. because the Exodus happened during the interregnum. But the Merenptah still does not throw any light on the possible date of the fusion and the acceptance of the new religion in Kadesh. All we can say with certainty is that they took place sometime between 1350 and 1215. Within this century, we assume the Exodus to have been very near to the first date, the events in Kadesh not far from the second. The greater part of the period we would reserve for the interval between the two events. A fairly long time would be necessary for the passions of the returning tribes to cool down after the murder of Moses, and for the influence of the Moses people, the Levites, to have become so strong as the compromise in Kadesh presupposes. 2 generations, 60 years, might suffice, but only just. The date inferred from the stele of Merenptah falls too early, and as we know that in our hypothesis one assumption only rests on another, we have to admit that this discussion shows a weak spot in the construction. Unfortunately, everything connected with the settling of the Jewish people in Canaan is highly obscure and confused. We might, of course, use the expedient of supposing that the name in the Israel stele does not refer to the tribes whose fate we are trying to follow, and who later on were united in the people of Israel. After all, the name of the Haviru, Hebrews, from the Amarna time was also passed on to this people. Whenever it was that the different tribes were united into a nation by accepting the same religion, it might very well have been an occurrence of no great importance for the history of the world. The new religion might have been swept away by the stream of events. Yahweh would then have taken his place in the procession of erstwhile gods which Flaubert visualized, and of his people all the 12 tribes would have been lost. Not only the 10 for whom the Anglo-Saxon have so long been searching, the God Yahweh to whom the Midianites, Moses, led a new people, was probably in no way a remarkable being. A rude, narrow-minded local god, violent and bloodthirsty, he had promised his adherents to give them a land flowing with milk and honey, and he encouraged them to rid the country of its present inhabitants. Quotation, with the edge of the sword. End of quotation. It is truly astonishing that in spite of all the revisions in the biblical text, so much was allowed to stand whereby we may recognize his original nature. It is not even sure that his religion was a true monotheism, that it denied the character of God to other divinities. It probably sufficed that one's own God was more powerful than all strange gods. When the sequence of events took quite another course, then such beginnings would lead us to expect there can be only one reason for it. To one part of the people, the Egyptian Moses had given another and more spiritual conception of God, a single God who embraces the whole world, one as all-loving as he was all-powerful, who averse to all ceremonial and magic set humanity as its highest aim, a life of truth and justice. For incomplete as our information about the ethical side of the utter religion may be, it is surely significant that Akhenaten regularly described himself in his inscriptions as living in Ma'at, truth, justice. In the long run, it did not matter that the people, probably after a very short time, renounced the teaching of Moses and removed the man himself. The tradition itself remained, and its influence reached, though only slowly, in the course of centuries, the aim that was denied to Moses himself. The god Yahweh attained undeserved honor when, from Kadesh onward, Moses' deed of liberation was put down to his account, but he had to pay dear for this usurpation. The shadow of the God whose place he had taken became stronger than himself. At the end of the historical development, there arose beyond his being that of the forgotten Mosaic God. None can doubt that it was only the idea of this other God that enabled the people of Israel to surmount all their hardships and to survive until our time. It is no longer possible to determine the part the Levites played in the final victory of the Mosaic God over Yahweh. When the compromise at Kadesh was effected, they had raised their voice for Moses, their memory being still green of the master whose followers and countrymen they were. During the centuries since then, the Levites had become one with the people or with the priesthood, and it had become the main task of the priests to develop and supervise the ritual, besides caring for the holy text and revising them in accordance with their purposes. But was not all this sacrifice and ceremonial at bottom only magic and black art, such as the old doctrine of Moses had unconditionally condemned? There arose from the midst of the people an unending succession of men, not necessarily descended from Moses' people, but seized by the great and powerful tradition which had gradually grown in darkness. And it was these men, the prophets, who sedulously preached the old Mosaic doctrine. The deity spurns sacrifice and ceremonial. He demands only belief and a life of truth and justice. Ma'at. The efforts of the prophets met with enduring success. The doctrines with which they re-established the old belief became the permanent content of the Jewish religion. It is honor enough for the Jewish people that it has kept alive such a tradition and produced men who lent it their voice, even if the stimulus had first come from outside, from a great stranger. This description of events would leave me with a feeling of uncertainty, were it not that I can refer to the judgment of other expert research workers who see the importance of Moses for the history of Jewish religion in the same light, although they do not recognize his Egyptian origin. Selim says, for example, quotation, "Therefore, we have to picture the true religion of Moses, the belief he proclaimed in one ethical God, as being from now on, as a matter of course, the position of a small circle within the people. We cannot expect to find it from the start in the official cult, the priest's religion, in the general belief of the people. All we can expect is that here and there a spark flies up from the spiritual fire he had kindled, that his ideas have not died out, but have quietly influenced beliefs and customs until sooner or later, under the influence of special events or through some personality particularly immersed in this belief, they broke forth again more strongly and gained dominance with the broad mass of the people. It is from this point of view that we have to regard the early religious history of the old Israelites. Were we to reconstruct the Mosaic religion after the pattern laid down in the historical documents that describe the religion of the first 5 centuries in Canaan, we should fall into the worst methodical error. End of quotation. Wolves expresses himself still more explicitly. He says, quotation, that the heaven-soaring work of Moses was at first hardly understood and feebly carried out, until during the course of centuries it penetrated more and more into the spirit of the people, and at last found kindred souls in the great prophets who continued the work of the lonely founder. End of quotation. With this I have come to an end, my sole purpose having been to fit the figure of an Egyptian Moses into the framework of Jewish history. I may now express my conclusion in the shortest formula to the well-known duality of that history: 2 peoples who fuse together to form one nation, 2 kingdoms into which this nation divides, 2 names for the deity and the source of the Bible. We add 2 new ones, the founding of 2 new religions, the first one ousted by the second, and yet reappearing victorious. 2 founders of religions who are both called by the same name, Moses, and whose personalities we have to separate from each other, and all these dualities are necessary consequences of the first. One section of the people passed through what may properly be termed a traumatic experience, which the other was spared. There still remains much to discuss, to explain, and to assert. Only then would the interest in our purely historical study be fully warranted. In what exactly consists the intrinsic nature of a tradition and in what resides its peculiar power, how impossible it is to deny the personal influence of individual great men on the history of the world. What profanation of the grandiose multiformity of human life we commit if we recognize as sole motives those springing from material needs. From what sources certain ideas, especially religious ones, derive the power with which they subjugate individuals and peoples. To study all this on the particular case of Jewish history would be an alluring task. Such a continuation of my essay would link up with conclusions laid down 25 years ago in the Totem and Taboo, but I hardly trust my powers any further. I hope you have enjoyed this episode. Please share it and support us through the links available with this episode. Thank you and see you next time.